Thomas, thank you very much for joining me. You're a writer for many places, including New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and you've also written a book called Unlearning Race. And I'd love to talk to you about kind of the current cultural situation. And also, I think maybe the place to start is that Unlearning Race now, while you've got books like White Fragility at the top of the charts and How to Be an Anti-Racist, seems countercultural almost, or it's not the current understanding of where the discussion is at right now. What are you making of the current kind of situation?
The current situation is a complicated one. On the one hand, it is heartening to see such interest being paid to questions of how race is constructed, how it's enforced, imposed, how it governs our lives and our society. This is all to the good. But as you point out, the main books, the texts that are being quoted and cited everywhere are texts that I do take issue with because they, in many ways, reinscribe ideas of racial essentialism that my book is arguing against and that I'm trying to get the conversation to look past. So you have a book like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is the big bestseller right now. And it's problematic in certain ways because it presents white people as an undifferentiated mass, not as individuals with agency. And it presents blacks in a way that's quite troubling to me as kind of like an undifferentiated mass of people who are fundamentally oppressed and can only ever react to the real agents of history who are whites, who are also paradoxically not individuals. And then on the other hand, you have Ibram Kendi and some others who, they make very persuasive and good calls for anti-racism, but they kind of enforce another kind of essentialism that sees people as fundamentally black and fundamentally white. And my argument is not necessarily at odds with Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, but it doesn't stop at the notion that you have to be an anti-racist. I think we have to do two things at the same time. We have to, on the one hand, fight racism, which is real and which governs our lives. But we also have to always keep our eye on the ultimate objective, which would be to do away with the categories of race that racism imposes. I start from the premise that racism creates race and not the other way around.
Yeah, I think, as you're saying, like you have to balance these things at the same time. That seems to be a very difficult conversation to have right now because it's very nuanced. For example, Brett Weinstein put out a piece talking about, he's an evolutionary biologist, and said that talking about race can be very dangerous because it essentially triggers some very deep evolutionary drives. It enforces tribalism. So how can you have that conversation while at the same time recognizing that there is deep-rooted inequality, there are legacies of oppression, and holding both of those at the same time, but not reimposing kind of these essential categories? Like that feels like a very delicate balancing act.
It is quite a delicate balancing act. And I think that part of the thing that we're seeing now is that not everybody is necessarily interested in making the effort to balance. So part of what has to happen is that people have to come as good faith interlocutors into the exchange. There is quite, I wouldn't say that that's not out there, but it seems to me that there's kind of less of an appetite for that now than there was certainly in 2008, when the nation seemed to be like, in a good faith way, fundamentally inspired by the idea that maybe we could transcend this kind of historical sin that defines our country. And of course, that kind of euphoria was very short-lived, and we soon saw the limits of the symbolic victory of having a mixed-race black man, put mixed race in quotes, at the helm of the government. And now it seems that the disappointment was such that there's less and less of a generosity and willingness for people even on the left to give up these categories. I feel like oftentimes it's a very lonely place to be saying that the ultimate goal still has to be to transcend racial categories because they don't biologically exist in meaningful ways. That's not something that everybody agrees with anymore. And I remember very well in 2008, that would be something that people would say was the ultimate goal. So It's tricky. And, and some of it has to do with the fact that they're making inroads. People are making progress by reifying these categories, by doubling down on them. It's working. It's getting people to concede quite a lot. So it's tough to tell people that this thing that's working in a pragmatic sense is something that doesn't work in a philosophical or maybe even moral or ethical sense, and you should actually give it up.
Or might have long-term consequences that are going to be
That's right.
dangerous.
That some of these victories and gains might be pyrrhic in nature. Yeah.
I'm interested in your journey through this. Like, how did you become particularly interested, and where have you ended up in your kind of explorations of this topic?
So my journey on race has always been somewhat out of the mainstream because I'm 39 years old. I was born in 1981. I'm the son of a Black man from the segregated South. My father's actually from Galveston, Texas. It's June 19th today, which is Juneteenth, which is the traditional holiday because slaves in Galveston were freed about 2 years after everybody else. And so when they got the news that they were freed, they ran into the streets and rejoiced. That's Juneteenth. So my father comes from that world. He was born in 1937, fully became an adult before civil rights. My mother's a white woman from San Diego, California. And my brother and I were raised in what looks to others as a multiracial family, but we were raised by both of our parents as though we were a Black family. My mother was white, but we were not raised as biracial. We were regarded as Black by the Black kids and the white kids that we knew, and our parents raised us to be Black, and we accepted that. And it wasn't a very complicated relationship to identity that I grew up with in New Jersey. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I married a white woman from France, moved to Paris, and found myself more and more in conversations where I was trying to explain the logic of the one-drop rule, which governed my own sense of self back in the States, but which Europeans don't necessarily assume and aren't necessarily even familiar with. So when people would ask me, in France, the question is often, what are your origins? And that means, because the French don't necessarily speak about race as such, that means, what are you? And so I would say I'm Black, and that would often draw a kind of surprise that it doesn't draw back in the States. And then I'd get into these conversations, and I found myself defending this logic of hypodescent and the one-drop rule, which is really the logic of the plantation. And I found myself less and less convinced by it the more I spent time out of the United States. But I couldn't quite get myself to give up on it. In 2012, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that no matter what my wife and my children would look like, they would be Black, because Black is a choice, and it's a discipline, and it's a kind of it's a moral stance. And I kind of really realized that I was writing that op-ed to convince an audience of one, which was myself. It was difficult for me to break with this kind of constructed identity that had always been just my reflexive understanding of myself. But when my daughter Marlo was actually born in 2013, her physical presence in my life suddenly thrust what I guess I would call the fiction of race before me in a way that my own mixed background never had. And it wasn't the realization that I had a white daughter with blonde hair and blue eyes and white skin. It was that I fundamentally don't believe that you can be a different race than your child, or that you can be a different race than your parent. I didn't see a white child there. I just saw, if I can have a daughter like this, what does it even mean for me to be a Black man? And what does it mean for her to be walking into the world presumed to be white if she can be directly descended from Black slaves? So then that began the process of what became the book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's also a generational thing, because I was brought up by very racially aware, anti-racist, left-wing parents. And I can remember back then, I'm confused. Like, I don't really understand the world we're in now, because it seems that, for example, I remember being brought up and being told why the word coloured was no longer okay. This is in the 1980s. And now we've kind of ended up in this place where people of colour seems to be the accepted definition. And I remember, like, even as an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old, understanding, or at least I thought I understood at the time, that it was inherently othering to have a word that sort of meant them and us. And now suddenly we've ended up in this place where there seems to be another kind of, I'm confused, and I think a lot of people, kind of white liberals like myself, feel very, unsure and quite scared in some ways to say certain things now, because there are it seems that there is a certain set of actions and a certain set of ways of talking about this that is the accepted wisdom, rather than what I used to understand as kind of being anti-racist.
There's the accepted wisdom, but that accepted wisdom is also rapidly shifting all the time. So you're constantly having to rearrange the way you think about language and the way you think about referring to other groups of people. People of color is a term that really bothers me on several levels. First of all, it's extraordinarily imprecise. 9/10 of the world or more fits into that definition, because only a tiny fraction of humanity is European or European descended. And it seems to take this 9/10 of humanity and define them as like solely having this thing in common, which is their mistreatment by white people. That's the only thing that would link a Latina, a Black person, a Chinese person in the American discourse that seeks to put them together as people of color. So it's a way, it's a kind of backdoor right back into white supremacy by other means. If you think about it for even a second, it separates people into whites and non-whites, and the relation is one of domination and hierarchy. And that's what I'm trying to get past. But the language itself, the terms are shifting. I mean, just this week, the conversation is about now more and more publications will be capitalizing the letter B in Black, but will not be capitalizing white. So every group will be capitalized, but only one group will not be capitalized. And there'll be white people who will understand that they are still the center of everybody else's drama and story.
Yeah, that they're the default in some ways.
Yeah.
I've seen, even in the last 2 weeks, a lot of friends on Facebook, for example, posting POC, and asking questions like, does anyone know any good POC facilitators?
Yes.
And for me, that feels incredibly dehumanizing. So to see this language come in full force in the last couple of weeks in a way that, for me, feels I would never use it, because I feel that is dehumanizing. To call someone a POC, for me, is really, I don't know. I'm in this strange world. I see this sort of strange world growing around me, and I don't know how to navigate it. I'm confused.
Well,
you're not scared.
You're not alone there, but it's dehumanizing also to think that my view is only valuable or wanted or necessary because I'm a POC. The world that I want to create and that we were supposed to be moving towards is a world where views are valid or not valid based on their intrinsic merit, that all people are welcome and not discriminated against based on their characteristics beyond their control, and that this is how we kind of orient the public sphere. But the idea, my wife sent me a tweet yesterday that was a screenshot of a restaurant owner's email. She had been contacted for an interview with a newspaper, and her response was, "We're an all white owned establishment, and so my new policy is that I need to know if you are also interviewing POC restaurant owners, and if not, then I want to give up my slot in the article so you can talk to a POC." It seems on the one hand like what she's doing is generous and correcting a kind of exclusion that's going on, but if you stop to think about it for even a second, this is crazy, and it's reinscribing a racial essentialism. It has nothing to do with the restaurant. Just go out and find a POC. It doesn't matter what the person is. It doesn't matter if the person's Laotian. It doesn't matter if the person's Filipino. It doesn't matter if they're Latina. This is all interchangeable. I'm a white person. I have privilege. So let me give up my seat to anybody, regardless of what they have to say or if it's even relevant to your story. And so just the idea that what we're doing, the world that we're in the process of hastily creating is one that reinscribes race as the only category that matters and that cannot be transcended, is a dangerous place to be going back to, regardless of whether we're there from malicious intent or from well-meaning stumbles that we're making along the way.
And it's worse than that, because it's not just a world where race is primary. It's also that a certain particular type of opinion within that category is primary as well. Like you say, it's not.
What I was trying to say, but the minority within the minority is deracinated. You're not actually. You're an artificial Indian or an artificial black man if you don't. You're an artificial gay man if you don't. Pete Buttigieg, for example, was called actually the first straight gay candidate for president because he wasn't an authentic gay man, because his views disqualified him from having that voice. We've seen Ayanna Pressley, the representative member of the squad with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. She talked about, we no longer want to have black and brown faces without black and brown voices. This gets dangerous. This is how you quash healthy disagreement, and this is how you quash and squash the ability for people to challenge orthodoxies that may or may not be actually held by the majority of whatever group you're claiming to speak on behalf of.
Yeah, and I've not spoken publicly on any of these topics before, but I was listening to the Sam Harris podcast the other day, and I thought he made a really good point, which was, I could have got on Glenn Lowry to talk about this. I could have got on Coleman Hughes. I'm really interested in talking to you because you've got a background in thinking very hard about these issues to explore in conversation with. But the idea that we can't talk about certain things if we're not from that background seems to be part of the problem.
Well, absolutely. That's how you preclude the possibility of dialogue. That's what the idea that there's what Glenn Lowry calls, and what I'm very convinced is a real problem in today's discourse, is this idea of identity epistemology. That because I am black, I have access to some kind of knowledge that you can never possess. So the only thing that you can do is you can be quiet and listen and be an ally. But the only way that the only authentic allyship is silence. That's not, we all know that can't possibly hold, that can't work. That's not how you build a multi-ethnic society that works. And, there's a backlash there, like we talked in the beginning, of unforeseen consequences to short-term power grabs. This is partially, I don't want to say it's the only reason, but this is partially how we did end up with someone like Trump resonating so widely. We're creating a society where everybody has an identity that gives them a knowledge and a morality. We're moving towards identity ethics. So everybody can be proud of their identity, and it gives them some special insight into the human condition, except for one group. And that one group is the group that's historically been in power and that is aware that it's demographically shrinking. And so what does that set up? That sets up a situation where that group is some of members of that group are going to fight like hell to react in the worst possible ways to this new world that clearly singles them out and punishes them. So this is where we are in this horrifically polarized society with Donald Trump as our president, representing this embattled, soon-to-be minority.
Yeah, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this topic as a writer, because that type of kind of epistemology seems to be the death of art, primarily, because it's the death of empathy. It's the death of, like, I know that you were heavily influenced by hip hop culture growing up, as was I. Some of my favorite albums of all time, Mos Def's Black on Both Sides.
Just listening to that today.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah.
Kendrick Lamar. I was obsessed with Kendrick Lamar from kind of Good Kid, Mad City onwards. For me, those kind of artists and the way they talk about the Black experience, and also the kind of the liberation of the Black experience, that's of huge value to humanity. That's of huge value to all of us. And this sort of sense of epistemology that kind of ties into like the whole idea of cultural appropriation just seems like it walls us off from each other in a way that seems incredibly dangerous and damaging.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the way that we've made such gains, you could argue, is through I have criticisms of what the representation of authentic Blackness through hip hop culture, through the mainstream hip hop culture that was sold to us in the 90s and early 2000s. I have criticisms of what that did to the image that we bought of ourselves. But also, it'd be impossible to argue that the world's embrace of hip hop music and culture hasn't done as much or more to humanize Blacks in the eyes of the rest of the world. That's done more. That and some professional sports have done an enormous amount of work that even the civil rights movement couldn't fully attain. It made people fall in love with the culture and the people who made it. So art has a way of communicating that politics never can, that polemics never can, that you can read a novel and have an understanding of something going on that you just won't get from an op-ed, no matter what. So the idea that now we're shutting that down, I mean, there was just this argument that this part Puerto Rican woman who wrote American Dirt, which Oprah's book club picked last fall, this big bestseller that dealt with like an important moral issue of our time, which is, immigration on the southern border. This woman wrote a novel about it, and she brought a huge amount of readers to this subject, and readers who might not have approached the subject otherwise. And she was essentially dressed down and told that she couldn't do this. And I think that we're heading into a very dangerous place where everybody doesn't just not have access to the whole human story and access to each other's stories, but everybody can only write their own very narrow and specific story, which is a way of segregating ideas and experiences. So I can only ever talk to you about my Black identity, but I can never talk to you about, apparently I can never talk to you about my love and knowledge of French literature or art or food culture. I don't know if I have the right to wear the name Thomas Chatterton, who was a great poet from Bristol. That's not, do I have a claim to that? Am I supposed to be silent on that? We're getting into a dangerous place, but the way that it works in fact is that everybody actually can basically do things except for again, white people. White people can't, because there's some understood power relation in white people using other people's stories. So I think that what we have to do and what's difficult to do is just have principles and values that apply equally to everybody and not have these kind of caveats that always try to seek to address in very imprecise ways historical power imbalances. Because the problem with this type of correction is that we see all too often we're overcorrecting in ways that invite unforeseen consequences and that make it impossible to talk to each other and understand each other.
I wanted to return to what you just said about hip hop culture, because that's what I love about Mos Def. I remember he's got a song called Hip Hop that I think is one of the greatest love kind of letters to the art. And he says in that, hip hop is prosecution evidence, an out of court settlement, add space for liquor, which is, so hip hop is also critical of itself. Like the greatest hip hop is also self-reflective and critical. And the other side of it as well that I find very disconcerting with a lot of the current dynamics is that it makes, and another Mos Def line where he talks about invisible man got the whole world watching. Like Black culture has been probably the driving force of American culture and from Elvis Presley onwards, and how much it's been kind of appropriated. Yeah, how much it was appropriated by white artists as well. But it's so intertwined with how we think of America and the driving force of America, probably one of the main driving forces of America. And what seems very disturbing about the current framing of only seeing Black people as victims seems to exclude that. And actually, like, there's so much to be inspired by, proud of, and amazed by in Black culture.
I agree 100%. I mean, that's the kind of Black Southern tradition my father comes from, and that seems very normal and natural to me. You don't think of yourself as a victim. This is a group of people. You know, Ralph Ellison called Blackness a kind of discipline, and that resonates with me very deeply. I've always been very proud to be, I guess, part of a culture and a tradition that that achieved extraordinary artistic and global contributions, that survived, that didn't just survive, but survived with a blues sensibility that was a kind of stoicism and a kind of taking the worst that life gave you and flipping it with a little bit of style and a little bit of swag and turning it into something that actually, yeah, people sitting in Paris wanted to hear Louis Armstrong. He's taking American pain and flipping it. This is something to be proud of. And there's no people in the world that doesn't have a history of pain and exploitation. It depends at what point in time you catch them in this, you know, in the struggle. But I've always been proud to be Black. I've never seen it as something that was akin to a disability, which is the way, and I don't mean to, I have to actually, I don't want to get in trouble for saying something that sounds ableist or anything like that. I simply mean that I never thought of being Black as something other than a form of strength and discipline and a way of understanding America that maybe gave me access to a truth about America. James Baldwin has spoken and written very eloquently about there being something quite monstrous about getting to the age of 40 and never having actually known pain and never having actually lost something and never having struggled. And then something happens to you later in life and you can't take it. And this is how he described a certain type of whiteness that operates in society, you know, a certain type of innocence. And I never wanted that or aspired to that. So I have a tough time with the privilege conversation because I don't think that some of the insights into human life and nature that coming up in a Black tradition exposed me to, I don't think of that as being as lacking in privilege. In fact, I think of that as something that's helped me grow to almost the age of 40 in a way that I'm proud of.
And how do you hold that tension? Because your book's called Unlearning Race, but we're also talking about the value of Black culture, Black America as a distinct thing in itself. Is there not a paradox there?
I don't think so. I think that you can and a lot of people sometimes I give talks and I see that some people in the audience who define themselves as Black, they're open to the idea of moving past race, but it hurts a little bit to think of severing ties with a group of people they want to express solidarity with, which is something completely understandable. But I think it's very different to say race isn't real. There's nothing about blood and skin that we're talking about. We're talking about belonging to a community of people, a tradition, a certain region. Regionalism matters. You know, being Black in America is not the same as being quote unquote Black in Jamaica or, you know, anywhere else. So you can belong to these people, but we also have to find different ways of belonging to people who don't come from this community or tradition. We have to rethink what makes us Americans, what makes us humans, what makes us citizens of the 21st century. I think that holding on to Blackness as a culture is as healthy as holding on to Italianness as a culture or Jewishness as a religion and a culture. But we're all, and it almost gets to the point where people would laugh at you for pointing this out. But what we are is we're members of the human race. I mean, you have to have both a more general understanding of yourself. We're just members of the human race, and a much more specific understanding of yourself. I'm a British guy from Yorkshire, or my mother's side comes from Vienna, and my father's side comes from Sicily. That's where my people come from. But before that, they came from another place. I mean, it's actually hard to ask people to speak about themselves this way because we want these kind of easy, monolithic color labels to slap onto extremely diverse experiences and just to make it easy for us to categorize ourselves. But I think that we have to achieve a perspective that goes beyond that if we're ever going to get past this kind of balkanized debate that's paralyzing our society.
And when I was sort of doing a little bit of research before this conversation, I read an article in the New York Review of Books where you were put together with I think people like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, and described as black conservatives, which didn't seem right. I'll get your reaction to that.
Los Angeles Review of Books, right?
The LARB.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that characterization?
I mean, it's lazy. It bothers me because I define myself as a liberal, have always certainly voted that way, find no home in the Republican Party whatsoever. Perhaps if the writer was implying that there are elements of cultural conservatism in there, maybe that's the case. Maybe I don't. I guess maybe, yeah. If conserving elements of the past make sense, maybe he was implying that we're conservative in the way that Ralph Ellison can be called conservative personality or something like this. But it's also kind of slanderous, and it's used as an epithet when another black writer calls you a conservative. If you don't identify that way, it's a way of delegitimizing any kind of heterodox aspects of your views that don't go with the kind of woke left orthodoxy that carries the day right now. So it bothers me quite a bit. And as far as I'm aware, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, any of those guys that I routinely get lumped with, none of them define themselves as conservative. I think only Glenn Lowry did in the 90s, but he redefined himself. So it's just something that, it's a label that I reject and I try to argue back against.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck, like, it struck me as very odd. I mean, I would describe you all as heterodox thinkers, but certainly not conservative. And it felt like a way of kind of policing the conversation in terms of what views are allowed within kind of the liberal world and which are not. And I find that really, really interesting as a phenomenon, because there's this kind of paradox that only one particular perspective is allowed if you're from a certain minority group. And that seems essentialist at its core. That the sort of paradox of that seems incredibly dehumanizing and a real paradox of the way that the left can think about race at times.
Yeah, and it's not just other so-called blacks who will level that at you. If you look, I don't know, I mean, the news cycle moves so fast, but recently Joe Biden, in an interview with a black interlocutor, made an off-the-cuff remark like, the interviewer was asking him for more time to ask some more questions to go back to his community to make the case for voting for Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's response was, well, you just tell them, if you gotta make up your mind about whether to vote for me or the other guy, you ain't really black. It's mind-blowing, it's extraordinarily patronizing, and it kind of it makes an essentialism out of what should actually be something far more complicated. And of course, I understand that, 9 out of 10 black people won't ever vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. I certainly won't, even after he said that. But the idea that you must think a certain way in order to be authentically yourself as a member of this community is really, I think it's destructive.
But it's also concerning that on the other side, you have people like Candace Owens using that as a way of being more divisive. That in some ways is far more concerning when you see that kind of that truth kind of weaponized on the other side in a very divisive way.
You mean Candace Owens, somebody who's just sabotaging the conversation for her own personal gain?
Yeah, but I mean, I see her being very, very divisive. I mean, she has elements of truth in some of what she's saying, but she's using it in a very politically charged way to argue for black people to vote Trump, to vote Republican.
Well, yeah, I just don't take someone like Candace Owens as a good faith conversation partner. So I think that it is very important to, I think it's important to think through who is actually coming into the debate in a good faith way. And so someone like Candace Owens is kind of a non-starter. She's done so much that's so sensational. It's kind of a non-starter. But to dismiss someone like who we've been talking about, like Glenn or John, is not authentically representing a Black position because they diverge from the orthodoxy is something else altogether. I think it's really important, and that's what kind of the problem is with Candace Owens, because she inserts herself into the debate, and then people can lump her with a guy who's a serious guy like John McWhorter, and then the whole conversation breaks down.
So why do you think things have shifted in this direction? What's your sense of why we've moved in this direction since 2008?
I think that there is real profound and in many ways justified disappointment with the limits of what actually happened. I think that certainly there's extraordinary disappointment with the idea that someone, no matter what your politics are, someone as elegant and as fundamentally, trying to do what he believes is right, someone who was trying to unify the nation, somebody like Barack Obama could be followed by someone like Donald Trump, who appeals to the most divisive aspects of the American discourse, who really, it's an insult to follow Barack Obama by Donald Trump, and there's really no way around that. So I think that exacerbated things quite a bit. I think you can't talk about any of this without talking about the impact of social media on all of our lives and the kind of incentives, the dopamine-driven incentives that, drive our politics of recrimination and, that break us into warring tribes, following politics as a sport, the kind of self-righteous witch hunt that goes down to find somebody who's transgressed and then shame them on social media, and then you're kind of rediscovering your tribal identity makes me in turn rediscover mine, and my tribal feelings intensify. So we see everything all the time now, and we're always in conversation about everything all the time. So all of these factors come into play at the same time, and I think that we're trying to figure out how to make our cultures, our societies, our world work when we're exposed to each other and each other's flaws and each other's limitations more than we've ever been in the past.
Thomas, thank you very much. It's a really interesting conversation. I'm really, really glad that you agreed to do it.
Thanks for having me.
Rebel Wisdom was set up to make sense of the world at a deeper level than the mainstream media. It was built for these times of crisis and change, which is why we want to do what we can to meet the challenge of the times. More films, and also for our Rebel Wisdom members, weekly sense-making calls with our amazing interviewees. And also, we're introducing the Wisdom Gym, a place to practice some of the skills that we've talked about on the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.